In the meantime, let's hear from the Democratic Alliance, of course, the official opposition in Parliament. For now, Solly Malatsi, good afternoon to you.
For now.
Are you expecting to stay the official? We'll get to that in a sec. First, tonight's State of the Nation address. What do you want from the President?
Hi, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here. Look, I think what we are likely going to see more than what we want is that the President will try and use the SONA, given that it's won before an election, to attempt to parade victories that, he has won throughout his 5 years. In reality, we've got very low expectations of, what he would be able to do given the state of South Africa now, where we've got record levels of unemployment, where the cost of living, is at an unprecedented high level, where generally in households, South Africans are just struggling to live, to survive and feed their families. So the mood in the country also is one of difficulty. We're going to hear more of a party alliance speech than an outline of what his government has been able to do.
So if you look at the nature of South African society, the inequality, the racialized inequality, the poverty that we have coming out of the pandemic, all of the issues that we have, what would the DA do? What would be the great sort of economic plan that you would follow?
Look, it's a very important thing because ultimately the economic outlook of a country has a lot of bearing in terms of, one, the ability to attract the investment to create jobs, but also to balance that with uplifting vulnerable members of society. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism, and I want to deal with it in terms of the propaganda that's been used against the DA with regards to social grants, for instance, that we would, discontinue social grant, which is not the truth. In reality, when you look at our alternative budget, which we outlined ahead of the budget last year, what we're calling for is the increment of those budgets to be able to be at the same level as the poverty line, because while everything else has increased, the ability of vulnerable residents to provide for their families is very little. You look in terms of our economic outlook, right? There's a strong correlation between that and investor confidence. And there are very simple things that you can do that are related to also policy, not policy orientation, but also the general behavior of government in terms of ethical leadership, in terms of accountability when tackling corruption. I was very fascinated by what, my opponent in the ANC said, Mahlengi Mbengi, with their expectations there. All of these, when they happen at the same time, they are gradually able to boost the economic standing of a country. And in order for that to happen, I think we need a total change of governance. I think South Africa always thought the ANC has had sufficient chances in order to implement what it would need to do.
So, I accept all of those things.
Yeah.
It's interesting because politics and elections, there's a famous president who did campaign on the economy in the US, it was Bill Clinton, and the phrase was, and it's not directed at you, it's directed at voters, but it said it's the economy stupid. In other words, it was about growing the economy. And you need something catchy. And in all of the years that the Democratic Alliance has critiqued, often fairly accurately, the ANC's economic strategy, and we see, unfortunately, the figures show that the economy is not growing, never seen that kind of crisp, I know it's hard, but that crisp economic message.
Yeah, look, there's the important thing with an economic message is the ability to make it relatable to the population, and when you do that comparison, if you look at the lifespan of democracy, for instance, in our country, and at a time when Bill Clinton ran on that, it's quite different. I think in a South African context, mobilizing on the economy, it's a very difficult thing because ultimately people want to see how does that relate to maximizing my chances of getting a fair chance of getting a job. But in the South African context, we have to look at the education system. Does the education system then produce the type of prospective employees whose skills are needed and can be absorbed in order to escape the economic difficulty that we are in?
I made a crack at the beginning. You laugh politely about whether the DA would still be the official opposition after this election. There's some polling that suggests, in fact, while the Democratic Alliance often talks about your governance record in the Western Cape, that, in fact, we saw polling this week that the Democratic Alliance could lose outright control of the Western Cape, 4 to 42%. Did that come as a bit of a shock?
It didn't come as a shock because of where the polling comes from, and the record that Ipsos has with polling and under-polling the DA's performance. You have done pieces on polling yourself in the past where you've talked also about the weaknesses in the modeling of Ipsos. It's very fascinating. In the last election, Ipsos had us polling at 11%. which was, a shock to us because we do polling on a consistent period. In fact, we've got a permanent polling operation that is able to forecast where we were. So we honestly don't hold in high regard the polling that Ipsos does.
So I hear you on Ipsos,
previous failures.
But Professor David Everett, who's not just a professor of politics, but also the chair of the Council of Stats SA, knows a bit more about numbers than I do.
Yeah.
I mean, the 42% is his figure. I would take that seriously.
Yeah, but also look at it. Let's break down, that poll in itself. It had a component of it allocating people, asking people whether will you be voting for the multi-party charter. I mean, the multi-party charter is not going to be on the ballot. Sure. That is one flaw that can influence the direction of where a poll goes. So obviously polling, I mean, there are different polls that produce different outcomes. But when we compare, and I'm not being defensive here, when we compare it with what we are doing, we see that, there are inconsistencies in terms of a snapshot poll taken, at a particular given time than trends that you are able to monitor over 3 months, over like 9 months period. But ultimately, Stevens, the poll that matters the most, is the one that's on election day that will be able to, allay all of these conflicting views that are on the market. But in terms of what we are seeing from our own polling, which has never been, over 5% of the mark in terms of projection of where we stand, we are confident that, the two other polls must have something fundamentally, they must have some weaknesses with their modeling to produce the outcomes that they are.
Not the last argument you and I are going to have about polling before the elections. Solly Malatsi,
definitely not.
Very much indeed. Spokesperson, national spokesperson for the Democratic Alliance. Let's